I'm joined today by Andrew Turner, who's a disabled veteran and activist for veterans' rights. He's a former Guantanamo Bay prison guard, an advocate for access to plant-based health options, and for closing Guantanamo Bay. Andrew, there's so much to talk about with you, so I'll just jump right in. How long were
Sure.
you a guard at GITMO?
Right around 9 months.
Okay. And when you went there, what was your sort of general belief about what it was like there, what was going on, what your experience would be like?
So, so I initially had volunteered to go in 2009. The Navy had a program called the Individual Augmentee Program, where they would come along and say, "Hey, we need this group of people for these deployments." This option came up to go to Guantanamo. This was after the president had signed the executive order to close it. So the understanding was we would be going to be part of the task force that would be there to close it.
Hmm.
And I felt that that was I wanted to be part of that versus being there keeping it open, obviously.
So you were already going in with the opinion that it should be closed down.
Yes, sir.
And why did you feel that way?
You know, initially they set up Guantanamo maybe with some form of good intentions. I don't really know. I don't totally understand or even want to try to explain what those intentions may have been initially to keep people safer, I guess is what always the argument has been about keeping it open. But I've always kind of viewed it when we passed the first year or two and we weren't focused on due process for detainees, and standing up for the rights that we as Americans always seem to hold dear. I started to have kind of an issue with what was going on there. At the time, I was already obviously active duty in the military, so it's much tougher to do things like protest and other things when it directly reflects some type of government action.
Hmm. And what impact did being there have on your mental state, on your mental health?
Oh, I never knew. Had, had I known now what impact that would have had, I probably would have thought twice about going down there.
Hmm.
Obviously, I tried to go down there with good intentions. Um, I have quite a bit of empathy for people that are detained indefinitely. I don't agree with the actions our government's taken, and maybe that partially affected me. But then also while I was there, I early on I was violently assaulted by a particularly angry detainee that was trying to injure himself.
Hmm.
And while we were trying to keep him from doing that, he started smashing his head into the floor, wound up doing some pretty bad damage to my right hand to the point where I no longer have what would be considered a fully functional hand. And that definitely affected me. But I think, also just the amount of time working there definitely uh, changed things for me. And about a year later, after I returned, I wound up being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and a generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah. Um, what does the average person, even people who follow what's at least published about what goes on at Guantanamo Bay, what does the average person not realize about the day to day of what's going on there?
Well, I think there's a big assumption that every guard that goes down there is somehow complicit in what many would consider the evils of our country, when the reality is many went down there either voluntarily by taking one of these individual augmentee sets of orders, or going down there with some type of a unit. And many of them were of the ideal that the three words fair, firm, and impartial meant something,
Hmm.
and still to this day do. And so there's always this right or left thinking about it, when the reality is it isn't black and white. Neither the military presence there nor even the lives of the detainees. It's just not black and white, and it's not easily explained for the average person to where they would understand what's going on there.
I read the Reddit Ask Me Anything that you did recently, sort of in
Sure,
preparation for our interview, and I noticed that there were
sure,
a number of questions asked that you sort of said you couldn't really talk about the answers there. Now, to
right.
clarify, is that because the answers would reveal classified information, or because you signed a non-disclosure agreement, which is sort of a very different reason for not being able to discuss something?
Both, both.
Both.
I mean, it's obviously some of the work was classified. I was actually attached to Task Force Platinum, which I can't talk about, partly due to its classification, but also because of the non-disclosure agreement that I signed.
Hmm.
And so anything that touches on operational, anything that touches on specific detainees, anything that that we've been briefed that we can't talk about, I can't talk about, and I don't know when that will ever change.
Yeah. Do you think that that is part of the reason why there isn't more of a proactive uprising about closing Gitmo? Because a lot of what goes on there just never really gets to people here in the United States?
No, I think the far bigger problem is we've allowed the political narrative to become fear over if it closes, and we focused on due process and we looked at moving detainees that we plan to try and detain long term, through punishments that our courts decide on. I think that we've allowed the political message to be permeated by fear of things like Islamophobia and the, this concept that somehow they're going to not escape while they're at Guantanamo, but somehow if we brought them here to America, or to the U.S. and tried them in courts and then detained them somewhere, or at that point, if they were found guilty, imprisoned them in somewhere like the Supermax in Colorado or the maximum security prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, that somehow they would escape and be loose, or somehow they'd be allowed to be loose. And that's the farthest thing from the truth.
Yeah, I mean, that argument
But
sort of implies that we can't really trust the most secure prisons in the U.S. to keep
right,
people inside, right? If the argument is
right,
even if they're on American soil, in the most secure of all prisons, those
right.
prisons just aren't good enough, is what the argument sort of implies, isn't it?
Well, that and that our U.S. court system, our federal court system here in America, is somehow subpar compared to the military tribunals that have failed to even try 20 detainees in
Yeah.
15 years.
I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned PTSD, generalized anxiety, as a result of this incident where you were attacked by a detainee at Gitmo. When I introduced you, I mentioned you're also an advocate for plant-based health options. And one of those that
Yes, sir.
many people may not have heard of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is kratom. How is it pronounced correctly?
You'll generally hear it either kratom or kratom.
Okay.
There
Talk to us
there is
about
other
what that
pronunciations, but
is and the controversy surrounding it right now.
sure. So kratom is a it's a leaf off a tree, generally grown in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Borneo, imported here into the U.S. Up until this past year, for the most part, the FDA and DEA played kind of hands off, and then the FDA came in and did kind of an import alert early in 2015, and they started having the Marshals and Customs seize shipments from vendors, and it was already kind of difficult for the vendors because then they had to, just the way the whole FDA dietary ingredient rules changed in 1994 with the Deshay Act. It's always been kind of tough to sell this and market it because you had to market it as not for human consumption, and it's just this weird limbo that it was placed in. Well, then in September 1st, the DEA came out and put in a proposal of intention to make it a Schedule One substance.
Right.
A schedule at that point, a Schedule One substance pretty much cuts off any kind of research, and there was some really promising research already going on. So nobody really understood why, without any kind of input between the FDA, DEA, and the research community and the consumer community where this came from, because it didn't make a lot of sense. They've since retracted that, opened up for public comments. They received record number of public comments about this. I just did an interview for my own podcast a couple days ago, and there's a social worker and her team that are actually working on breaking down all the public comments, and they've even found that it's over 99% support keeping it legal.
And for people who don't know, Andrew, I mean, we're talking about something that, if I understand correctly, in small doses, the effects are caffeine-like, and in larger doses, sure. Is it fair to say similar to opiates?
I wouldn't say opiates per se, but it does. There's 27 alkaloids, 27 plus alkaloids in the plant itself, as the way, consumers would get it. And a couple of those alkaloids would be opioid-like, not opioid. There's a little bit of a difference, and that's due to how it interacts with the opioid receptors in the body. But even the researchers have said that you couldn't really call it an opioid, and definitely not an opiate, because that would mean it would be coming from the opium plant, and it doesn't. The tree's a little more related to the coffee plant than it is anything else. But it does have some analgesic effects. It does interact with the opioid receptors, so a lot of people use it for pain management. There's some that take it, and it's become really effective for a lot of people getting off very hard opiate substances, and even things like Suboxone and methadone, that for a long time was the only way to get off like a heroin addiction. But then they in turn created you into a methadone or a Suboxone addict, and they even had far worse withdrawal symptoms. So this gave a lot of people a chance at kind of a new life. And so when this proposal to schedule it came out, it crushed a lot of people. It was very scary to think that the government would take away something that was helping so many.
Well, it seems to me like a total pharmaceutical industrial complex attack, right? I mean, when you talk about something that all of a sudden is going to Schedule 1, something that wasn't even on the radar of so many people for so long, at a time when we're learning more and more about its uses, it seems like a money grab from me. And the key thing is, as you mentioned, it seems to be effective in weaning people off of opiates. And for many companies, that means losing money, doesn't it?
And I think that's part of it. I think that's, there's also been a couple of trade groups from the supplement industry that for a while now have tried to get kratom's legal clarification removed, and it completely taken off the market, maybe partly because they have to go through such stringent laws that they wanted everybody to, but instead of saying, hey, why isn't there better regulation of this, they wanted it banned too. And then you come to find out that some of these companies also represent Bayer, BASF, DuPont, right, and these large chemical companies, not just pharmaceutical, but also chemical companies that make quote unquote supplements.
Sure. Well, listen, we're going to be following both what goes on with kratom and what goes on at Guantanamo Bay. I really want to thank you for sharing your story today. We have been speaking with Andrew Turner, who's a disabled veteran, activist for veterans' rights, and also a former Guantanamo Bay prison guard. If appreciate you talking to us today.
Hey, David, yep. Can I share one last thing?
Please.
There's a petition to the White House going on right now. If anyone is interested in signing it to keep kratom legal, we're still working on those petitions to the White House. This one you can find at the American Kratom Association's website. Just Google American Kratom Association. There's more information about the petition to the White House currently. We're just trying to keep it legal and accessible for anyone that wants to have that access.